Hey everybody, how you doing? I'm here today to give you my top 5 tips for smashing AQA Psych Paper 2. It's going to be specific to Paper 2, not generic study advice, and I'm loosely going to rank them. Let's do it. Right, number 5 is prepare for and make the most of comparison. So, in Paper 2, in the approaches section, you can be asked comparison questions. You might have to talk about the similarities or the differences or a way in which they overlap between two approaches. It might give you an approach and let you pick another one, or it might specify two. So you do really need to know a similarity and a difference, at least one of each, for each possible combination of approaches. What kind of things can you compare them on? Well, it can be a more kind of knowledge or assumption-based thing, like it might be about how one approach makes more emphasis on internal factors or external factors. You could say that one approach makes use of the scientific method and controlled lab experiments. So you could talk about it that way, but you could also compare them in terms of things like their application to the real world, treatments and therapies, things like that. Yeah. So there's lots of different things that you could compare them on, but make the most of it as well. If you're doing just a straightforward outline and evaluate an approach, you could, in some of your evaluation or in some of your conclusions, you could make reference to the fact that the approach you're talking about is maybe the most appropriate or a better method of explaining or treating whatever than the alternative approaches, just to beef that up a bit. Look out for questions that say refer to another approach. That doesn't mean you have to compare if it says that. You just need to make a reference to. That's literally what it says, isn't it? But you can compare if you like, if you're comfortable with comparison and you feel it fits. So, prepare for and make the most of comparison. Number 4 is design a study. Yeah, prepare for this. Practice it. Find some past paper questions on this if you haven't done so already. They can come up as 9 markers or 12 markers. Basically, you need to follow the bullet points. It'll give you a bit of a scenario or a bit of a prompt as to what it wants you to do. It'll give you some context. It might be about designing a study that's going to take place in a gym or a school, or a study that's going to compare cognitive abilities of schizophrenia patients with a control group, or whatever it might be. So it'll give you something to go on, but it'll give you some specific bullet points. It might be about explaining the task that the participants are going to do. It might be about selecting a type of observation you're going to do. For example, like, is it going to be controlled? Is it going to be covert? All of that, yeah. It might be a bullet point asking you to write a consent form, to design a data table, to explain how you're going to do stats testing on it. Yeah, it can be pretty much anything, but you must follow the bullet points. Any kind of talk around that, for example, if you start talking about how you're going to recruit your participants, if it doesn't say that, you're not really going to get credit for that, so don't waste your time. Whatever you say, it needs to be practical, yeah? You need to give the examiner enough information that they could actually go and carry out that bit of the study that you've described, yeah? So don't just say, I'm going to make them do a sorting task, or I'm going to make them give a presentation, or make them read an article or whatever, yeah? Specifically tell the examiner what that would be about. So give them things like, how long is it going to take? What is the article going to be about? Is it going to be the same article for everybody? What are you going to tell the participants? What instructions are there? Yeah? Be specific, be practical. Make sure you operationalize stuff, particularly when you're talking about your variables or you're doing your behavioral categories if it's an observation. It must not be generic or broad or vague. So not, writing down stuff like, I'm going to observe playful behavior. I'm going to observe friendly behavior. Yeah? Be specific. I'm going to count the number of smiles that I see, the number of hugs that I see, the number of physical contact that I see. Specific, operationalized stuff. Look out for justify. Yeah? Often in these questions, you're going to have to explain why you've made the decision that you have. Why did you choose a covert study in this context? Why did you choose event sampling in this context? Yeah? And try and give more than one example for things like types of observation. Don't just say covert. Pick another type. So say it's covert and it's naturalistic or whatever it might be. Yeah? Behavioral categories for an observation. Give 2 or 3 different examples. Don't just give one. There you go. If you want some more tips on that and you want a walkthrough, I do have a designer study walkthrough video. Check it out. Number 3. So we're going to just talk for a sec about common mix-ups in paper 2. Okay? So, types and designs of experiment. So if it says types here, that means field, Lab, quasi, natural. If it says designs, that's where you talk about your independent groups, your repeated measures, and your matched pairs. Just while we're talking about it, natural versus field. Natural experiments is where there's no manipulation of the IV, right? Something like the Romanian orphan study. A field experiment is where you are manipulating an IV, but it's done out kind of in the real world, in a natural setting, right? So you're studying the behavior in the setting that it would usually occur in. Those are different things, right? Try not to mix them up. Participant versus data sampling. So data sampling is about how you're going to collect your data, for example, in an observation, so that's time or event. Participant sampling is how you're going to get your people, right? So things like your stratified, your opportunity, volunteer, all of that, yeah? Extraneous versus confounding variables. So confounding variables are things that apply to, like the whole of one group. So that they basically become an alternate IV. So they're really, really bad for internal validity. Extraneous variables might apply kind of, sporadically or randomly to any or all participants. So they're not helpful, but they don't completely undermine the internal validity. Yeah? I'll give you a quick example. If you're doing a memory test or a study where you're looking at maybe 2 memory tasks and you're going to compare, let's say you're going to do 2 groups, you're going to compare males and females, right? See who's got better STM or whatever you're going to do. Let's say that I study all of the females in the morning, maybe between 9 and 10, and then I study all of the males maybe between 1 and 2 in the afternoon. Now, time there is a confounding variable because any difference at the end might be due to, studying morning versus afternoon. Or it might be male versus female. We don't know. So that's a confounding variable. Time there could also be an extraneous variable if it was done like this. So let's say I was just going to study them all one by one, just randomly throughout the day. And let's say I studied some of the female participants at maybe 9 or half 9, and then some of them at 10, some of them at 1, some of them at 3, some of them at 4, and the same thing with the males. Yeah, so they're all getting a different time of day, but it doesn't systematically affect all of one group. Yeah, so it's extraneous if it doesn't systematically affect all of one group. Descriptive versus inferential statistics. Inferential is about stats testing. Descriptive is your dispersion and your central tendency, and by that I mean dispersion is about spread, so it's standard deviation and range. Central tendency is your averages, mean, median, mode. Conditioning concepts often confused. Operant and classical. Operant is through consequences. Classical is through association. Don't confuse negative reinforcement with punishment either. Negative reinforcement is where you take away something bad, and that encourages you to do that behavior again, because that's good, right? If I take away something bad, like if I say, no homework today, you've done really well, that's negative reinforcement. I'm taking away something you didn't want. Yeah? Punishment is adding something bad to your life. Yeah? It's a negative consequence. Okay. Neurotransmitters versus hormones. Neurotransmitters are what we're talking about in the synapse. Hormones, that's the endocrine system, or endocrine system. That's the stuff that's going in the blood. Yeah? Localization versus lateralization. Localization is about key kind of regions or areas. Yeah? So like your motor, somatosensory, visual, auditory, all of that. Lateralization is about the sides of the brain. Lateral, think back to maths, right? Quadrilateral, 4 sides. Lateral, side. Number 2, read the STEM, then read it again. Paper 2 is the most application-heavy paper, yeah? Now, the STEMs, you'll usually find that they kind of lead you in a certain direction. So look out, particularly in some of the approaches STEMs, look out for things that are leading you towards defense mechanisms. So things like, if you see mention of frustration or anger, or you see mention of kind of, refusing to accept something, then you're probably expected to be talking about displacement and denial. Yeah. If you see reference to kind of like making a mess or chewing pens or anything like that, you're probably talking about the psychosexual stages and, for example, oral fixations. If you see reference to kind of older siblings or parents of a child and kind of copying behavior, you're talking about maybe the idea of modeling and imitation. If you see reference to twins, you're probably talking about genotype and phenotype. If you see reference to maybe like someone's done a study and they're making an assumption based on maybe the time taken to do a task, you're probably talking about inference and the cognitive approach. There will be lots of reading in research methods, as you know. Look out particularly in the STEM for things like how variables are operationalized, so that you know, for example, whether it's ordinal or interval data or whatever, really useful for stats tests. look out for phrases like, the researcher was not aware of any previous studies, because that tells you that you need to be using a non-directional hypothesis. Look out for important data hiding in the text as well. You'll often find calculated values or significance levels hiding somewhere else in the text and not exactly where you might want it in the question. Yeah? Look out particularly for, if you're doing a correlation, you're looking at scatter graphs, you might find that the correlation coefficient is kind of with the graph or even before it and not necessarily where you might expect it. So look out, highlight, underline stuff, go back to it after you've read it more than once. And that brings us to my top tip for smashing AQA Psych Paper 2, which is context in research methods. Look out for phrases like in this study. So many marks get lost here, yeah? It's easily missed. It is a lot of pressure when you're there in the exam. It's easy to miss, but look out specifically for things like in this study. You'll see it in questions asking you maybe to evaluate methods. So, explain why an independent group design is, good in this study. So you need to show some application. Yeah, explain why maybe you couldn't do repeated measures or whatever it might be. Same thing with sampling. Explain why opportunity sampling maybe is a limitation in this study. So, if you're talking about maybe a researcher going up to a student cafe or something and selecting participants that way, explain why that's bad in that study. Context. Improvements, modifications, bias. Again, it might be that you need to think about some specific information that you're given in the scenario about maybe instructions that are being given by the researcher. Maybe an improvement in this study is to get an independent researcher to come and do that bit instead, but make a link to the STEM. Same thing with things like randomization and standardization. Look at maybe instructions or tasks that are being given. Think about how you could randomize participants, all of that sort of stuff, but context again. Using 5% versus 1% significance levels. Think about the context. If it's maybe something that could be a bit socially sensitive or, unethical, it could go wrong if there's a false positive, then what you want to do is minimize the chance of that false positive. So that's why you might use the 1% significance level. Same thing with justifying things like stats tests and all of that sort of thing. Look at your variables that are being used and how they're operationalized, okay? But you need to look out for things like in this study. Probably the most important phrase to watch out for in paper 2. Okay, that was me discussing, probably in a slightly long-winded way, my top 5 tips for smashing AQA Psych paper 2. I hope that was useful for you. Let me know in the comments if you've got any questions or anything else. Good luck. Go smash it.